Clever men like Sir Christopher Wren only occur just now and then. No one expects in perpetuity architects of his ingenuity. No, never a cleverer dipped his pen than clever Sir Christopher Wren. And yet, it's an accident of fate. If anyone had been asked to predict Wren's future career when he was born in Wiltshire in October 1632, everybody would have said he was going to be a vicar. No contest. It was a no-brainer. His father was a clergyman. His uncle was a senior clergyman, and they were senior. I mean, they were big names. As the 1630s wore on, they both allied themselves to Archbishop Laud, to the High Church party. Wren's uncle, Matthew, became Bishop of Ely. Wren's dad became Dean of Windsor. He was completely cocooned in this High Church world. And then, 1642, in fact 1641, because in 1641, Matthew Wren was consigned to the Tower of London as Bishop of Ely, and he was there for the next 18 years. He actually did better than Archbishop Laud, who lost his head, of course. Soldiers in the Civil War kicked Wren's dad out of the deanery in Windsor. He lost his living at East Knoyle in Wiltshire, where he also lived. And the idea of the Church of England just became a non-starter in the turmoil of the 1640s. Wren's world, as much as anybody's, more than anybody's in a sense, Wren's world was turned upside down. That phrase we hear so often in the 1640s and 1650s. Wren's world really was turned upside down. There were soldiers ransacking his home. The rest of his life can be seen as an attempt to make sense of the world, to make sense of a world that just didn't make any sense to him as a young adolescent. He decides not to go into the church. He's always a brilliant young lad. In 1649, he goes up to Wadham College, Oxford, where he's described everybody. I mean, he must have been such a swot, I'll tell you, because everybody talks about this miracle of a youth, this extraordinary genius. Wren, as a young lad, is bright. He's at Wadham. He then goes as a fellow to All Souls. This is sometimes shown, this is a most wonderful sundial, All Souls College. It's sometimes shown as Wren's work. Believe that if you like, I'm not sure. It's a lovely sundial, and Wren was to All Souls College. That's all I'm going to say. And All Souls was the perfect college because it didn't have any students. It was a research institute. While Wren is there, he comes into contact quite early on with a group of experimental scientists, experimental philosophers, people who aren't content to just accept the old classical text, to accept Aristotle and Galen. They want to see for themselves. They want to see exactly what's going on with the world. And they start to look. They start to look. They don't take it for granted. They look. And Wren is part of that group. He's 17, 16, 17. And he's admitted to a circle of experimental philosophers who will change the world. It's an astonishing time to be alive. His early work is in medicine. Wren is almost certainly the first person in the world to perform a splenectomy. He removes the spleen of a spaniel. Poor child. He looks quite apprehensive, doesn't he? He removes the spleen of a spaniel. He uses a sow-gelder's knife. He writes a very detailed account of it. I mean, it's an account. I mean, I'm as squeamish as anything. I find it difficult to even read the account. But this is at a time, of course, he does it without anaesthetic. But then operations are performed on human beings without anaesthetic at this time. It's interesting that Samuel Pepys never ever celebrated his birthday or his wedding anniversary. He celebrated the anniversary of the day that he was cut for the stone, and he survived it. Traumatic experience, a lot more traumatic if you were a spaniel, I'll tell you. Wren removed the spaniel's spleen, and the spaniel survived. He didn't do it for fun. He did it because it's just at a time when the old humoral pathology, the idea of the humours, is being questioned, when Harvey is suggesting the circulation of the blood, and people are saying, well, what's the spleen for? What does it do? And Wren says, well, let's take it out and see if it does anything. It was actually the early 20th century before people worked out actually what the spleen did, and to be honest, I'm still not sure. But the spaniel survived. He removed the spleen from Robert Boyle's spaniel, who was rechristened Spleen in honour of the event, and who was nicked a couple of years later. He was so famous that somebody stole him. Wren also, if you've ever had an IV drip, Wren, you have to thank for it. Wren is probably the first person to introduce intravenous substances into the blood. Again, I tell you, spaniels had a bad time of it in the 17th century. He injected opium into the lateral saphenous vein, the back leg of a spaniel. Again, it was one of Boyle's spaniels, I think. And they did it to see if the spaniel would get stoned. And it did. The point about this experiment was to look at the circulation of substances through the body. And somebody suggested, Boyle suggested, you know, if we could work out how to introduce a substance into the blood flow, we could see how, you know, if blood reached the head. And Wren said, I can do it. He devised a tiny little brass, a syringe in a way, which allowed him to pump opium into this lucky or luckless dog. I don't know, it made it anyway. Because of that, blood transfusions began to be experimented. I mean, they were I don't know why no one died. They didn't. They because of Wren's work in the 1660s, the people who came after him started to experiment with transfusing blood. But they didn't just do humans. They thought, well, let's try sheep's blood into a person. Let's try cow's blood. Now, I can only think that the transfusions were so useless that hardly any blood got into the system, because otherwise people would have been pegging out right, left and centre. Wren is at the heart. Wren wanted to be a doctor. He wanted to be a physician when he was a young man. He was very heavily involved with an Oxford physician called Thomas Willis. In fact, when Thomas Willis wrote a pioneering book on the anatomy of the brain, Cerebri Anatome, it was Wren who drew the illustrations. Some of the first illustrations, the one on the right there, is one of Wren's illustrations to Willis's work on the anatomy of the brain. Wren worked with his brother-in-law, William Holder, to devise a sign language. This is the forerunner of BSL. Wren's drawing of a way of using the fingers, touching the fingers to spell out letters. He's got this amazing thirst for knowledge. You present him with a problem, he solves it. That's what Wren does, and he's still not 20. He's the most remarkable man. While he's at Oxford, and he's playing with spaniels and dissecting brains, he's also becoming more and more interested in the mathematical sciences. And from the early 1650s onwards, he starts to focus his interests, his skills, on astronomy. For example, a little bit later in the early 1660s, this is not Wren's drawing of the moon, but Wren produces a model of the moon, which Charles II at the Restoration will keep in his private chamber. It's so remarkable. Wren develops new telescopes, new ways of looking. He is deeply involved in the tracking of comets. Blazing stars appear in England in the 1660s, the early 1660s, and Wren is very heavily involved in trying to work out what these blazing stars are there for, what they're doing, why they track across the sky in the way that they do. He's also very heavily involved in the 1650s in one of the big puzzles of the mid-17th century was what's Saturn all about? What's Saturn doing there? Ever since Galileo at the beginning of the century had looked at Saturn through a telescope and seen a couple of wiggly bits on the side. It wasn't a very good telescope. So he's seen a couple of wiggly bits on the side. Look like handles. A few years later, people look through a telescope at Saturn and it looks as if there's two moons, two blobs on either side. They look a bit later. There's nothing. Everything's gone. Now, we know, of course, that the rings of Saturn, they couldn't resolve the rings of Saturn from the telescopes they're looking at. But what we know what's happening is that Saturn is being presented to the Earth at different angles. So sometimes when the rings are edge on, you couldn't see them. When the rings are flat on, you could see them like their handles. Nobody could work out what on earth was going on there. Wren said, what about if there are rings around Saturn? This is Wren's drawings of a hypothesis for the changing appearance of Saturn. And in fact, up in the top left there is an engraving of Wren's model of Saturn. He didn't quite get it right. I mean, I love the guy, and I wish I could say he did. He didn't quite get it right. He thought those rings couldn't possibly be floating there. They must touch the planet at 2 points. So he didn't quite get it right, but he came a huge step closer to explaining the different shapes of Saturn, how Saturn was working. And in 1657, as we've heard from Valerie, in 1657, he becomes, at the age of, he's actually only 34, he becomes Professor of Astronomy at Gresham College on Bishopsgate. I say at the age of, yes, he's 24 in 1657. He becomes a Professor of Astronomy. Oddly enough, the vacancy, it's amazing how these things happen, the vacancy was the professorship, the chair of geometry. And what seems to have happened is that Lawrence Rooke, who was the Professor of Astronomy at Gresham, thought that the Professor of Geometry's lodgings were nicer. And so he said, I'm having them. So he moved across, he became Professor of Geometry. The job of Professor of Geometry became Professor of Astronomy, and Wren walked into it. And for 4 years, again, moving with a lot of the people he'd known in Oxford. They were drifting back to London during the Commonwealth. And Wren is working with William Petty, with Rooke, with John Wilkins, who's the warden of Wadham College and who's involved in London society at the time. There's a whole bunch of people who are looking to see how the world works. Wren is involved with them, and he's involved with them as an equal. His main interests as an astronomer at Gresham are, as Valerie's told us, they were very practical things. I mean, the big driving force in 17th century astronomy was finding out how longitude worked. I mean, obviously, you couldn't have a chronometer that's going to be accurate enough. That was a ridiculous idea. So what you had to do was try and work out a way of measuring longitude by the stars or by Jupiter's moons, the different relationship between Jupiter and its moons. There are lots of ways of doing it. This is what Wren was driving at. This is what he was after. And while he's doing that, he's he's spending some of his time in Oxford, some of his time in London at Gresham. He's got chambers. They're not the nice chambers at Gresham. They're the next nice chambers, because Lawrence Rooke's got the nice rooms. And as he's doing that, and in 1660, famously, it's after one of Wren's lectures at Gresham College that some of his mates walk out and say, let's start a club, lads. The Royal Society is born, literally after one of Wren's lectures, and Wren is a founding member of it. But just as the Royal Society gets off the ground, Wren gets a second chair. He becomes Savilian Professor of Astronomy at Oxford. So he moves back to Oxford. And while he's there, while he's building maps of the moon, while he's making telescopes, while he's looking longingly at spaniels, all the time, he's just starting to think about buildings, just a little bit. He's set on that path, probably by Uncle Matthew, who's finally been let out of the tower, thank goodness. And Uncle Matthew, as a thanksgiving for his liberation from the Tower of London, gives a whole heap of money to his old college, which is Pembroke College, Cambridge, to build a new chapel. And he says, his nephew, Christopher, says, let me have a go at that. I can do it. And the result, probably, we think, the very first building Wren ever designed, and one of the first classical buildings in Oxford, is Pembroke College Chapel. At about the same time, though, John Fell, the Dean of Christ Church, and who will soon become Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University, is getting himself in a bit of a twist about the graduation ceremonies in Oxford. because they take place in the University Church in Oxford. And they're quite bawdy affairs. They're quite boisterous. Students are students, you know. And yes, the dirty jokes are in Latin, which kind of makes them respectable, but not respectable enough. So there's a move in Oxford to get the graduation ceremonies out of the University Church and into a purpose-built graduation hall. The old warden of All Souls, Wren's old warden, is a man called Gilbert Sheldon. Gilbert Sheldon of the Restoration becomes Bishop of London and then indeed Archbishop of Canterbury. And Gilbert Sheldon says, look, I'll front an appeal for a new graduation hall in Oxford. We'll see what happens. What happened was nobody gave. Nobody, not a penny, nothing, zilch. And poor old Gilbert Sheldon is left to foot the entire bill, 14,000 quid. Which is why the graduation hall is called the Sheldonian Theatre. He earned it. But interestingly, these two quite senior members of the Church of England, John Fell and Gilbert Sheldon, go to the Professor of Astronomy, the young 20-something Professor of Astronomy in Oxford, to Wren. And Wren says, let me have a go. He's not, you know, he's maybe built this box, or he's designed the box of a chapel at Pembroke College, that's all. And he says, I can do something here. And it's not just something, unless you know the Sheldonian Theatre, but it's the most amazing feat of engineering. What Wren did, he based it on the Temple of Marcellus in Rome. Now, the Temple of Marcellus was a huge D-shaped building, as the Sheldonian is. The Temple of Marcellus was open to the skies, because in Rome, the sun shone. In Oxford, it never does. So he had to create the most amazing roof, the most amazing wide span. And he used a system of interlocking timbers above the ceiling to support it. He was helped by Thomas Willis, in fact, and by a couple of his experimental philosopher friends. But he's not just building something. You know, as a complete amateur, he's building something revolutionary. People, it's fashionable these days to look at the Sheldonian and think, oh, it's not that, not that. I couldn't do that. You know, I think that's a blooming good building myself. And for a first effort, it's really not bad, you know. Because of Gilbert Sheldon, Wren is moving in church circles. His uncle Matthew dies, Bishop of Ely. His father's died during the Commonwealth. But Wren's contacts are church contacts. Wren, although he's an astronomer, is very closely tied in with the Church of England. And Gilbert Sheldon, when he becomes Archbishop of Canterbury, suggests that Christopher Wren might like to go on a commission with the great and the good to see if something can be done about Old St Paul's Cathedral. It's all right, you know, it's a bit rickety. It doesn't look like this because a bolt of lightning knocked the steeple off in the 1570s. It's a bit rickety. It's been a bit rickety since the 1630s, 1640s. It's covered in scaffolding. The Roundhead troops who stabled their horses in the nave. There are buildings built against the walls all around it. There are shops all over the place. And it looks a bit like it's falling down. Wren said, let's have a look. Because it's got a place at this time. It's 1663, 1664, maybe 5. It's got a place in the heart of Restoration London because Charles I, Charles the Blessed Martyr, had paid for Inigo Jones to build a new west front. This is the west front of St Paul's Cathedral by Inigo Jones, put up in the 1630s. And that bit still kind of survives when Wren's there. And Wren says, come on, let's go and have a look. He works with a couple of other architects. He works with Sir Roger Pratt, who's probably the most eminent architect working in Britain in the 1660s, and who's just built Clarendon House on Piccadilly. And Sir Hugh May, who's working on, is a surveyor to Windsor Castle at the time. And Wren is not an architect. Wren's a don. Wren's an academic. And they all get together and have a look at St Paul's. Wren says, the crossing is looking a bit shaky. It's looking a bit rickety. He says, let's do something different with it. I know. Let's have a dome. No domes in England. Domes, one of the hardest constructional features it's possible to devise. Wren says, I could do that. I could do that. And there's this amazing meeting in August 1666 Wren has come back, I should say. During the plague, he went to France to discuss the appearance of comets in the sky with a group of French astronomers. And while he was there, he saw examples of some 3 or 4 rather nice domes. Val de Grace had one, the Jesuit church in Paris had one. So he's seen domes. He's come back to England and thought, I want to do a dome. He meets with the Dean Sancroft, the Dean of St Paul's, in August 1666. Roger Pratt is there, Hugh May, John Evelyn, the diarist, is there. And they all look at St Paul's. And Roger Pratt says, well, the walls are bending out a little bit, aren't they? But it's probably deliberate. It enhances the perspective. And yes, the crossing tower may look a bit like it's about to fall down, but we can shore that up. It's okay. Wren says, let me build a new one. Let me build a new one. And he has almost a fist fight with Roger Pratt. They have this huge scrap in the middle of the nave, and William Sancroft, the dean, has to separate them. He takes them to the chapter house, he sits them down, he gives them a glass of wine, and he says, calm down, boys. What we'll do, we will get some surveyors into St Paul's, and they will look at the structure, they will decide exactly what needs doing. And Roger Pratt's in a huge huff about this young whippersnapper, this Don, this astronomer, trying to tell him how to build a cathedral. And then, 1 week later, I have a friend in California who is convinced that it's Christopher Wren who lit the blue touch paper in Pudding Lane, because it made him. And at exactly this moment, 358 years ago, St Paul's went up in flames. The 4th of September. Late in the evening of the 4th of September, 1666, St Paul's went up in flames, and suddenly, whether those walls were bending deliberately or not, whether that crossing could be saved or not, was academic. Wren, to start with, Wren was brought in to patch things up. What he wanted to do, of course, famously, he wanted to rebuild London. This is Wenceslaus Holler's famous drawing of fire damage in London. So you've got the Thames down here, you probably know this, you've got the Thames down here, there's London Bridge, the only crossing, there's the Tower of London over on the bottom right, St Paul's Cathedral here, going across Ludgate Hill down Fleet Street. The white area is destroyed. The white area, 13,200 houses, 400 streets, 86 churches, the General Letter Office, the Custom House, the Royal Exchange, most of the Guildhall, completely destroyed in 3.5 days, 4 days. And within a week, really within 1 week of the fire breaking out, it breaks out in the early hours of Sunday morning, the 2nd of September. Within a week, Wren is in Charles II's private chamber at Whitehall saying, I've got this idea, let's rebuild London. Let me do it, I can do it. It's so incredible. I rather think that Wren must have been thinking about this beforehand. As John Evelyn tried to present a plan to Charles as well. There are half a dozen plans for the rebuilding of London that have survived. I suspect the 6 have survived. I suspect there were 600. I suspect any country squire was trying to work out, how to rebuild London. It was almost like a Renaissance exercise. And Wren's ideas, this kind of tripartite arrangement with there's the entrance to the city, there's the Fleet, there's St Paul's Cathedral, and these 2 great avenues bisecting, just stretching to either side. One going to a sort of piazza and down to the bridge, the other one going up to the Royal Exchange here, I think. It's a brilliant piece of work. And if you want to see it, Wren, as we know, Wren was never allowed to build it for all kinds of reasons. If you want to see Wren's London, you can. You need to go to Washington, D.C. Because Thomas Jefferson and Pierre L'Enfant, 100 years later, when they were building the Federal City on the banks of the Potomac, they borrowed engravings of Wren's London, and you can see the bones of Wren's London in Washington, D.C. if you look at the plans of it today. It's there, it's there. He wasn't allowed to rebuild London for all kinds of reasons. I said one of the most telling was that the City of London was in such a rush to rebuild. Charles II had promised that Londoners shouldn't lose out more than they had. No one knew who owned what. It was easier to build on the same street plan. It was just so much easier. So Wren's designs for London were, there was a time in October 1666 when Parliament was seriously discussing whether to go with Wren's plan or not. It was that close. But it didn't happen. He was, however, given a consolation prize, if you like, by the church because St Paul's Cathedral wasn't looking too good by the end of 1666. This is the remains of Inigo Jones's West Front. It was looking a bit rickety. Initially, they tried to patch it up, and Wren was involved in trying to patch it up. He's still Professor of Astronomy in Oxford, but in the late 1660s, he's involved in trying to patch up the cathedral. There are some falls of masonry, people are killed, and in the end, the Dean, William Sancroft, finally agrees that they're going to have to rebuild. They're going to have to rebuild the entire cathedral. Now, this is at the heart of London. Iconic is a word that's far too overused, but St Paul's meant more to Londoners than just about any other building. It stood, raised on a prominence on Ludgate Hill. It could be seen from all over the city. Its loss was a tremendous blow, a tremendous psychological blow to Londoners. And the idea was to rebuild it. Wren came up with, initially, with what we call the Greek cross design. A huge domed basilica with four arms, four wings to it, equal distances, equal lengths. That gradually morphed in 1668, 1669, later than that, 1670. It morphed, the Greek cross design morphed into the Great Model. The Great Model, so called because Charles II's warrant ordered a model as a perpetual and unchangeable rule and direction for the conduct of the whole work. And I mean, some of you will have seen, isn't it a great model? 2,230 man-hours to make this model. 907 ornaments. The great dome is plastered by the King's Master Plasterer. The Sergeant Painter, Robert Streeter, gilded the details. It was a stunning thing. And as it neared completion in the summer of 1674, protected from the sun in the chapter house in Paul's churchyard by calico curtains that are bought for the purpose, Wren starts to stake out the ground to build the Great Model design. One of the wonders of the capital, an awesome token of what was to come. And the Dean and Chapter of St Paul's thought, actually, I don't think so. You'd think, wouldn't you? But perhaps before the 2,230 man-hours had gone into making it, the 907 ornaments, the gilded... But no, the Dean and Chapter looked at it and they thought, no, it's too popish, it's too Catholic, it's too foreign. And of course, the big point was that they'd be dead before they could worship in the new St Paul's Cathedral, because with a central dome like that, you couldn't build it in sections. You had to build the whole thing virtually before it would work as a place of worship. So the Great Model marks this kind of unsettling break with the comfortable Gothic cake with classical icing that old St Paul's had been. And when Wren was told the news, when he was told that this wasn't going to be built, that the Dean and Chapter didn't want it after all, he cried, he wept. Wren was not an emotional man. He lives a life of the mind. He's a very cerebral character. He lives for 91 years. He's married for 9 of them, 2 wives. Most of the time, he lives an almost monastic existence. He lives an existence of problem solving. He lives most of his time in the coffee houses of London, talking with friends. He's not an emotional figure. He broke down and wept when they said that this wasn't going to be built. And his next reaction was anger. The Dean and Chapter said, we want something different. We want something more like the old building. So he said, okay, if that's what you want. He said he wasn't going to make any more models, no more presentation drawings. He said those devices did but lose time and subjected his business to incompetent judges, which every architect I've ever met thinks that secretly in their heart, you know. So in the spring of 1675, Wren offers the commission for rebuilding St Paul's a new scheme, as conventional as anything they could like, as practical as anything they could hope for, as breathtaking in its ugliness as the great model was beautiful. Spiky finials, a kind of a melon dome with a Chinese pagoda on top of it, and a very Inigo Jonesy west front to it, so they could feel like, you know, this is what it used to be like before the fire. It was hideous. And the Dean and chapter said, that's what we want. Lovely, that's the thing. That's what we're after all the time. The king approved the design, as well because we find it very artificial, proper and useful, as also because it is so ordered that it might be built and finished by parts. It was a conventional cruciform cathedral. They could build the east end of it, the choir. They could board that off. They could have services in the east end while they're still building the crossing and the nave, the west end. That's the whole point of it. You could build it in bits. But the king also said, privately, that Wren was at liberty to make variations rather ornamental than essential. And so he did. Now, I still don't know exactly how this works. You know, people used to say in the early mid-20th century, used to say that, oh, isn't it incredible that when the scaffolding came down, everyone must have gone, oh my goodness. You know, that's not how, you know, anyone who's been in a committee, that's not how these things work. You know, the Dean and chapter must have been crawling over this place every blooming month. So there must have been an awareness that the design was evolving. But it was still a fantastic, you know, leap of faith from that absurd warrant design to the definitive design. And let's not forget, I mean, familiarity can breed contempt. I'll tell you, I've been in here 100 times. Every time I walk in the door of St Paul's, my heart leaps because I think it is one of the most beautiful buildings on God's earth. It's the most fantastic achievement. Your heart swells when you're in it. It's a wonder. It's a wonder. Anyway, as if being the first Englishman to design and build a cathedral, which indeed he was, wasn't enough, Wren was also chief architect to the crown. In 1669, when St Paul's was still a distant dream, when the city churches were still smouldering ruins, the Surveyor General to the King's Works, the senior architect in the nation, a man called Sir John Denham, had a bit of an episode. John Denham never designed a single building. He got the Surveyor General's job because he was a very nice poet and he was very good to Charles II in exile in the 1650s. He lost his mind several times in the 1660s. He once burst into Charles II's private apartment and announced that he was the Holy Ghost come to judge him. And Charles thought that perhaps a break from the job might be in order. And when he died, he went bonkers again and died in 1669. And against all the odds, a professor of astronomy from Oxford was appointed to succeed him. Christopher Wren, who still had finished one building, Pembroke College Chapel. He'd almost finished the Sheldonian Theatre, not quite. And that was it. And he's appointed to the senior architectural post in the country. And that is, I'd like to say it's about Wren's genius. It's actually about Wren's connections. You know, he's very close to Charles II. John Webb, Inigo Jones's nephew by marriage, and probably the senior architect to work in the late 1660s, was absolutely beside himself with rage. He thought the job was his. And he's told, I mean, he's anyone who's qualified for it, but that won't do. An astronomy professor from Oxford gets it. And Wren says thank you very much. It brings with it a very nice house in Scotland Yard on the edge of the Whitehall complex. He decides to get married on the strength of it in 1669. And he marries his childhood sweetheart, in fact, a girl from Oxford called Faith Coghill. But he doesn't give up the day job. He carries on as a professor of astronomy at Oxford for the next 3 or 4 years, because he's not sure if he's going to like being an architect or not. His first official building was a customs house to replace the one burned in the fire. It's the building on the left here. It's great. It had taken nearly 3 years for for London to agree a design for the new customs house. Wren sits down at the board meeting the very first day he's appointed. He sits down, they show him the designs for the new customs house and said, "Look, Christopher, what do you think?" Mr. Wren, whatever they called him. And Wren said, "I don't know, lads." And you must have been in committee. You can just imagine everyone going, "Oh no, please no, we've got here." And now he's saying, "What?" And they said to Wren, "Well, if you can do better, 24 hours. 24 hours later, he comes back with that, and they build it. It's amazing. I mean, he and Hook designed the monument, originally partly designed as a fixed axis, fixed zenith telescope, because they got these huge lenses, and they didn't know what to do with them. And they thought if they fixed them into the monument, they might, obviously, their view of the heavens will be slightly limited because it's not going to move around at all. And oddly enough, the traffic noise is what scuppered that scheme. The traffic around the monument on Fish Street Hill caused so many vibrations that the lenses wouldn't work, so they had to abandon that. But he continues his interest in astronomy in 1675, when the accurate measurement of the movement of the stars still seemed the most obvious solution to the problem of longitude. Charles II resolves to build an observatory in order to the finding of the longitude of places for perfecting navigation and astronomy. The moving force behind the decision was a man called Sir Jonas Moore. In the summer of 1675, Moore took the young astronomer John Flamsteed under his wing, gave him lodgings, gave him a makeshift observatory at the Tower of London, and encouraged him in a plan to make a reliable catalogue of the fixed stars. And Flamsteed was appointed the first Astronomer Royal, and Wren was appointed to build a new observatory. Sir Jonas Moore wanted the observatory in Hyde Park. And it's because of Wren, who said the smoke pollution was so bad in London that you wouldn't be able to see the stars. So Wren said, "Why don't we put it up at Greenwich?" That's why you don't have Hyde Park time. You have Greenwich time because Wren was sensible. So he's done all that. He's building St Paul's. He's building an observatory. He's building Customs House. He's building palaces. He's repairing palaces. And on top of all this, he begins on the biggest church building program that the country's ever seen. He's doing these things simultaneously, because if St Paul's is Wren's greatest memorial, the City of London churches come a close second. They are astonishing. They share the same mythical status as St Paul's. They define the landscape of the capital in the 18th and 19th centuries. They rise phoenix-like from the Blitz in the 20th century, and they have the most weird names. Have you noticed? St Bennet Fink. What kind of name is that for a church? St Bennet Fink. St Mildred Poultry. St Dionys Backchurch. And they have equally bizarre histories. So St James Garlic Hive had a miraculous escape in 1941 when a high explosive bomb fell through the roof and rolled down the aisle and didn't go off. 50 years later, a crane took a corner, do you remember, took a corner slightly too tightly, and the crane just fell on it and demolished one half of St James Garlic Hive. St Christopher le Stocks was demolished in 1782 after the governor of the nearby Bank of England argued that its tower could be used by insurgents to lob bombs over the wall onto the Bank of England. Best knock the church down then. St Mary Aldermanbury. This is the only Wren building I haven't seen. I'm going to see it one day. It's the only Wren building I've not seen. St Mary Aldermanbury was firebombed in December 1940. It was dismantled in 1965 and it was re-erected in Fulton, Missouri, where it still stands, beautifully restored. It was put up at Westminster College in Fulton to commemorate Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, which was given at Fulton, Missouri. And it's the most, I say, one day I'm going to get there, one day. The problem-solving nature of Wren's psyche really comes out with the churches, I think. So St Antle and Watling Street, they're on the tightest sites. Some of them are on hexagonal or octagonal sites. Some of them are sort of wonky. They're not even rectangular. They've had a lot of knocking around. There's only 23 that survive. Wren actually built, I was going to say Wren designed 56 city churches, and that's not quite fair. Wren didn't design them all. He masterminded the plan. He worked with contractors. He did costing. Most of Wren's job, was not a very glamorous one. Most of his time, most of his days, were spent in what he called baiting builders' bills. And what he did most of the time was a mason would come in, give him a bill for 200 feet of stonework. Wren would go on site, take out his measure, say there's only 180 feet of there, I'm not paying you that. That's what he did, day after day, all the time. He's not sitting there dreaming up a St Paul's Cathedral or a St James Piccadilly or a Stephen Walbrook. Most of the time, he's arguing with contractors. That's what he did. We know he built some of the high-status churches. We know he built St James's Piccadilly. We know he built St Mary Le Bow. We know he built, this is a rather murky picture of St Mary Le Bow after. I love stained glass, but Wren said nothing adds beauty like light. And Wren's churches aren't meant for stained glass. There's some beautiful stained glass in the city churches now, but those churches that don't have stained glass, those churches that have clear glass, let the light flood in, they're so much more uplifting, I think, so much more inspiring. The churches presented him with all kinds of problems. Some of them, of course, the parishioners just said, we don't want any of this modern, arty-farty, contemporary architecture, thank you very much. We want the old stuff. So at St Mary Aldermary, even though Wren loathed Gothic architecture, he thought it was barbarous, it was uncivilized. Wren didn't think of himself as a Baroque architect, of course. Wren was a classicist, as far as he was concerned. He was resurrecting classical Roman civilized values. That's what he was about. And the parishioners at a few churches, including St Mary Aldermary, said, we don't want that classical stuff, thank you. We want our nice old Gothic church, and you can darn well build it for us because we're paying the bills. And so at St Mary Aldermary, you have this beautiful, beautiful vaulting by Wren, but he didn't like it. He was made to do it. And he didn't design, as I was saying, he didn't design a lot of the churches. The high status ones, the ones that have big budgets, we know they were by Wren. Some of them were by Robert Hooke, who worked as Wren's assistant on the city church building programme. Some of them were by clerks of works. Some of them were collaborations. We don't know. There are very few drawings left, original drawings, design drawings of the churches. And when they pose all kinds of problems. This is one of my favourites. This is the west front of St Edmund, King and Martha, Lombard Street. Beautiful. I know Robert Hooke's hand. I know that is drawn by Robert Hooke. It's a Robert Hooke design. But if you can see, probably even just at the back, you can see there's a squidge in the pediment there, a blot. That blot is actually a CW. It's Wren signing off the design by putting his name in the pediment to say to Robert Hooke, yeah, this one will do, this one's okay. And presumably there are others that he said, no, that won't do. Change this, alter the proportions here. They're all wonderful. They're all wonderful. I mean, my personal favourite, and let me just be clear, this is personal. My favourite, I think one of the great churches in London is actually St Stephen Walbrook. It's undergone some changes since Wren's day. So it has this blooming great block of travertine marble by Henry Moore, so that you sort of sit around this and feel like you're at an AA meeting or sort of psychotherapy counselling or something. Not that I know what an AA meeting is like. And, the point about that, I mean, it's a beautiful thing in itself, the Henry Moore altar, but it completely destroys the eastward thrust of what Wren's doing. He's trying to balance high and low church. He's trying to present a Protestant church for the 1670s and 80s in which the east end of the church, and this is St Stephen Walbrook as it was, with the box pews in place and with the altar at the east end still as the focus. So the east end is the mystical centre, the mystical focus of a church, any church. And yet it needs to be an acoustically sound auditory box because the sermon is at the centre of the Protestant tradition. So Wren is juggling all the time. He had very firm views about what churches should be like. He said, for a start, he said all builders were crooks. All church wardens were useless. They ignored the building, their care. All vicars, he said, were hopeless. They mumbled. You couldn't hear them speak as you could when he was a kid. He said there's no point in building a church which is so big you can't hear the sermon. So he reckoned the optimum size for a church was 2,000 people. He reckoned that any decent vicar standing up in the pulpit should be able to project to 2,000 people. The churches, I'm rabbiting on, the churches are there. Then what else does he do in his spare time? Chelsea. He builds a hospital at Chelsea. At one point, Chelsea is mooted as a new headquarters for the Royal Society. But in fact, shamed by Louis XIV's Les Invalides as a home for veteran soldiers. Charles II and then James decide to build a home for veterans at Chelsea Hospital. They also decide to convert the old palace at Greenwich into a hospital for naval veterans. And Wren is responsible for both of those buildings. Huge problems because although with Greenwich Hospital it was William and Mary, and Queen Mary gave the land for Greenwich Hospital, but she insisted that she didn't want to mess up the view from the Queen's house down to the river. So the whole thing had to be built in two halves. And Wren had this fantastic sort of Baroque plan for Greenwich. He had most of his plans, most of his grand plans didn't come to anything. And when you think what did, that's an astonishing thing to say. He wanted to rebuild Whitehall. Whitehall burned down in 1698, and he wanted to build the entire palace, rebuild the entire palace of Whitehall. He wanted to rebuild Hampton Court. He thought, let's get rid of the old Tudor stuff. You know, it's so yesterday, so 16th century. Let's have something modern. And in fact, William and Mary was a great mate of Wren's. When she died, William sort of lost heart and lost interest, and Wren was only allowed to build the King's Range, which you can see here. He only built a time, so he left the Tudor stuff for future generations. He also did a smattering. He didn't design houses. In the early 20th century, Wren was given credit for about 23 country houses. We're now down to 3. And I think there are big question marks over 2 of those. The only house I'm convinced that Wren designed was Tring, which no longer exists, which was built for William of Orange's treasurer, I think. He wasn't a private architect, he was a public architect. So he built a group of buildings at Oxford, the university. He built another group of buildings at Cambridge, including Trinity College Library on the right-hand side here, which again is one of the great buildings in this world. So lovely. And gradually he's become more than just an architect. Christopher Wren over the centuries has become something, he's become a kind of a symbol of England, if you like, as have his buildings. Look, I mean, this is 1920 odd. This wonderful carpet showrooms use St Paul's Cathedral. I've never quite seen Ludgate looking like that, but it's called, in the 1920s, it's called the Parish Church of Empire. You know, it gains a strange symbolic significance. And of course, famously, you know, that even if it was faked, that wonderful picture of St Paul's in the Blitz, defiant, God is on our side. The smoke is all around it, but St Paul's survives as a symbol of freedom, of England, of Englishness, of genius. And Wren, well, this ambitious, austere man was haunted in his last years. This is his death mask. He was haunted in the last years by a sense of failure. He thought he hadn't done it. He fell out with the authorities at St Paul's right at the end of his life because they wouldn't pay him, because they thought he was dragging his feet. Just as a quick aside, the moment the moment I would like to have been in Wren's life, there are a couple, the one I would really like to have been there, is at the end of his life, he walked off the site of St Paul's, but the Dean Godolphin, still needed to consult with Wren about some of the finishing details, the railings around the roof of St Paul's Cathedral. Wren wasn't speaking to the Dean, so the Dean couldn't go to his house, so he sent a member of the Commission for Rebuilding St Paul's. One of the commissioners was sent round to Wren's house to discuss the finishing off of the cathedral. That commissioner was Isaac Newton. Look, two men sitting across a table, Isaac Newton and Christopher Wren, talking about the finishing touches to make to St Paul's. Who wouldn't have wanted to be there, for heaven's sake? But he was haunted. He designed a palace to rival Versailles for Charles II at Winchester. It was built, it was roofed, and then Charles II died in 1685, and it was never occupied. It became a prisoner of war camp, it became a barracks, it blew up in the 19th century. Wren's great palace was never built. The White Palace at Whitehall, never built. Hampton Court, never built. And Wren said that the schemes that mattered most to him, a new capital, the great model of St Paul's, those palaces, they all foundered. And in old age, he said he wished he'd been a doctor, he wished he'd been a physician instead of an architect, because he said then he would have made some real money. And yet, I'll tell you, if failure means St Paul's Cathedral and Stephen Walbrook and Chelsea and Greenwich, if failure means the keen intellectual joy of the city churches, then I'd like some too. You know, he defined London's landscape. Wren altered the face of England forever. Walk into the street and you'll see Wren's London today. To have changed the world is no small thing. So, seek his monuments, look around you. Thank you. Thank you, very kind. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. That was magnificent. Thank you very much. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, if you can keep them quite brief, if anyone has questions. I've got a mic here to run the room a bit. Then we have to vacate the building probably at about 20 past or so. Anyone's interested, we'll go to the pub, as we always do, across the road, City of York, so do join us for that. So, any questions?
Hi. How true is it, you know that house that's on the south bank where Catherine of Aragon was supposed to be lodged, and it says that Christopher Wren, you know, sort of
Wren lived in St James's Street. He had a house in St James's Street. He had a house at Hampton Court. There is a plaque, and I think the plaque is on the house next door to the one Wren lived in, but don't tell anybody that, at Hampton Court. There's also a house at Windsor, which is now a hotel, which is supposed to have been Christopher Wren's house. I don't think there's any evidence for any of those. Wren attracted legends, and there's lots of. I mean, one of the great ones is about St Paul's, that he's supposed to have been told that his dome, which I should say weighed as much as the fully laden Titanic. I mean, this is a big thing. And the dean and chapter thought it wasn't going to hold. They thought it was going to give way. So they made Wren commission an anchor chain, an iron chain, which went all the way round the drum of the dome, sheathed in lead to hold it in place. And the legend is that one night before the lead sheathing was put on, Wren crept up into the drum. He sawed through one of the links of the chain, and then the lead sheathing went on, so that he and he alone would know that his design was That's rubbish. Wren was wetting himself for most of his life about St Paul's Cathedral falling down. There's a moment when he was shown the crypt. He was shown the pillars in the crypt bursting because of the weight, because he got it wrong. I mean, building wasn't an exact science, but all of these stories they kind of, the Victorians especially, like their heroes to be heroes, you know, and that's an example of that, I think. So which is a long way of saying,
He sounds like, from what you're saying, a difficult person.
Yeah, I think he was.
But to have been given all those opportunities, people must have liked him. What do you think he was like?
Yeah, I think he knew he was right. As a general rule. I'll tell you one strange thing about him. Say what he was like. He was about 5 foot tall. And it's funny, I mean, we know this because Charles II was about my height. I'm 6'3", 6'4". And there are, again, stories, they're not true, but there's these lovely stories about Wren designing the Prince's Lodging at Newmarket, which he didn't do. And there's a great tale that appeared in the 18th century that the ceiling was quite low. And Wren showed Charles II into the Prince's Lodging. And Charles II said, these ceilings are a bit low, Sir Christopher. And Wren said, no, they're not. And Charles II went down and said, well, you would say that, wouldn't you, Sir Christopher? And but it's strange how it affects the way you look at people, knowing their height. I think he was very passionate about his projects. I mean, he really, you know, he lived them, but he didn't have much of a personal life. As I said, he was married. He had 3 children that survived. He had a daughter who died in her 20s. He had a son who may have been mentally handicapped, we're not sure. And he had another son, Christopher, who he wanted to succeed him. So much so that when Wren was designing Marlborough House for the Duchess of Marlborough, he gave the design to his son. He attributed the design to his son. His son couldn't design a wall, but he wanted his son to get the credit so that he could take over as Surveyor General of Works. So he had a family life, but he lived in his head the whole time, I think. I say he's almost a monastic, austere man. As I said earlier, he's a very cerebral character. He lives a life of the mind all the time. So I think he was probably been rather difficult, in fact. I still love to have met him. I still love him.
In terms of the buildings, how much was down to Wren and how much was down to building contractors? Presumably contractors had a lot of influence on this.
Very, very good point, and one that I should have mentioned in my talk, in fact, because the church rebuilders, the rebuilding commission, and that is Wren and Hook and his assistants, were responsible for the structure. The fittings, the wonderful, you know, those wine glass pulpits, the reredos, they were the work of individual craftsmen or teams of craftsmen that were contracted by the churches themselves. At some of the big churches, Wren was probably advising, but he didn't design the interiors of any of them. St Paul's Cathedral, he did. He was commissioning and working as closely as one did. You know, anyway, in the 17th century building world, craftsmen had a great deal of leeway, certainly into ornament and decoration. But the big commissions Wren was involved with, most of them, he's not. You know, he's a supervising architect. So which is why you've got so much individuality in there, I think. You know, it always amazes me that at St Paul's, you know, at its height, there were 11 teams of 11 building firms working on St Paul's simultaneously, including 4 who were each building 1/4 of the dome. I mean, it's amazing it met at the top, isn't it? It's incredible. So a lot of his skills, which we don't think about so much today, were managerial. You know, he was a fantastic administrator, and he was also a fantastic political manoeuvrer. I mean, I said he was Surveyor General of the King's Works under Charles II. That's a political appointment. He remains Surveyor General under James II, under William and Mary, under William alone, under Queen Anne, and he finally gets the sack under George I. So he's got to have been quite an astute operator to keep his job and his house in Charing, you know, his house in Scotland Yard through 6 separate reigns.
So extending on David's point, to what extent were the equivalent of Arabs, the engineers, the master builders, the master masons, who actually took the back of the envelope, if you like, and and turn that into reality, so not just the design elements or the fine craftsmanship, the actual structure to make it work.
Yeah.
I mean, were there such people?
No, and basically it's the mason contractors who are doing that. These are people who have been raised in the building trades. Wren, more than most, I mean, it's a time when there are amateurs designing. You're right, amateurs drawing on the back of a fag packet all the time. John Evelyn designed buildings. Robert Hooke designed buildings. John Vanbrugh was a playwright, for heaven's sake, and he thinks, oh, let's do Blenheim and Castle Howard, shall we? Interestingly, his assistant, Nicholas Hawksmoor, learned his trade with Wren. He lived in Wren's house. He was a copyist for Wren. So what he did, when Wren drew the measured drawings for the builders to work from, layers of paper will be spread over these drawings and they would be pricked. So they would be pricked through with the important lines. And then Nicholas Hawksmoor, as a teenager, used to do that pricking through and then would draw the designs. So Hawksmoor learned his trade with Wren. But it's the builders, it's the professional builders that are really charged with making it happen. Wren was better than most in that he does have a mathematical background. You know, he's got there's no such thing as an engineering background then, but if there were, he's got a bit of one, you know. It's said that he and Hooke are supposed to have worked out the shape for the dome of St. Paul's from looking at a catenary arch, so that if you take a chain and you hold it like that, the shape made by the chain, if you were to sort of put it the right way up, it's got structural integrity, you know, which is a very mathematical point. So he did know something, but there's no experts. There's no CAD. You know, there's no. We think about the great builders of the past. It's amazing how they could do these things. We don't see their failures. You know, we only see the ones that stood up. We don't see I always think about this with medieval masons. You know, we think how fantastic they were to build Salisbury Cathedral or Westminster Abbey. That's fine, but we don't see the ones that fell down, do we? You know, so it's not an exact science. He knew more than most, I think. He knew more than most, but he's working with men from the building trades all the time.
It has been said that the dome of St. Stephen Walbrook was a test run for the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral.
It has. I think that's. There's no evidence for that. I think that's purely. There's a dome to St. Stephen Walbrook and there's a dome to St. Paul's Cathedral, therefore he was trying it out. It's not a true dome. It's not a proper. I mean, as you probably know, the dome at St. Paul's is an immensely sophisticated piece of work. For those of you who don't, there are 3 domes. There are 2 domes and a cone. Wren realised that in order to get a good visual interior, you had to have quite a shallow dome inside. To get a landmark, he had to have quite a high dome. So tall dome of timber sheathed with lead and shallow inner dome. Then he has a 365-ton cupola on top of that tall dome. In order to support that, there is a brick cone within, you know, sort of sandwiched between the 2 domes. An immensely sophisticated piece of work. But it's interesting that he'd been wanting to do domes ever since 1665, ever since he goes to Paris. There is a plan of Wren's. I showed you a diagram of Wren's plan for London. Wren's original drawing, which is so faint I couldn't show it to you, but Wren's original drawing of a new London after the fire shows St. Paul's Cathedral with a little circular dome on top of it. This is long before there's any chance of rebuilding St. Paul's. So it's something he'd always wanted to do.
I think we do one more. Sorry.
With regards to the interior of the Westminster Gallery,
Yeah.
I'm often asked, when taking people around St. Paul's, did he realise the effect, the sound effect?
I don't think so.
Created?
I don't think so. I mean, he was very good on acoustics. And it's almost intuitive, I think. I once gave a lecture on Wren's city churches at Stephen Walbrook. And the PA system broke down as I was about to speak. So it was a highlight of my life. I mounted the pulpit and gave a lecture with no sound system at all. And you could hear a pin. It was crystal clear. Within the dome, actually, in the corners, it was lousy. But so he did have a good sense of acoustics. But again, there's no way that you could design for that in those days. There's just no way you could have planned. He might have thought, well, this is a nice side effect. But he can't have done it deliberately, I don't think.
very prosaic question.
Oh, I like those.
It was very simply that somewhere in the dim distant past of my life, on a tour of St Paul, someone told me that every day the equivalent of a bucket load of stone falls off the cathedral.
Oh, crikey.
And that there are people going around who have to make sure that, you know, bits stone are swept up, whatever. And I'm thinking, if that were true, over the time period that St Paul was built, how much of it would actually be left? Does that mean that we are constantly having to add to and rebuild?
I've never heard about that. I mean, apart from anything else, I can't quite think what, you know, the consequences of getting a lump of stone on your head when you're wandering around. I can't see that. I mean, of course, now we've had the wonderful 300th anniversary restoration. Not a single shred or shard of stone is going to fall off that building, I'm sure. But I'd never heard that. I'd never heard. It's great.
Thanks, everyone. Just to wrap up, I'd like to. First of all, to thank, in the person of Valerie, Gresham College, and also a very nice talk to introduce our evening.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you all for coming. It's very nice of you to come out, and it's a joy to see you all again, and see you all again very soon. And finally, of course, I'd like to. You don't strike me as being a tie wearer, Adrian, but there we go. It's your.
Oh wow! I shall wear that one. Beautiful, complete with grasshopper. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, and thank you all. It's been a wonderful audience. You really have. You've been so good. Thank you. Thank you very much. I love this. Thank you.